$1 trillion. That's what the US spends or waste annually due to voluntary turnover. That number is astonishing. Today, we're going to talk about one of the drivers of that turnover, generational dynamics, right? How are people getting along in your workplace? And a lot of it is impacted by the generational the representation of which generation they come from. Okay. So, and how do you leverage the generational content or this context? How do you leverage it to truly retain your talent? Well, today we're going to dive into that a bit more so to provide you with some context or behind why are the generations so impactful on your workplace. Now, and if you don't know me, I'm Christina Green. I am the generational workforce consultant with Cardigan Careers. All right, so let's go ahead and jump right into it. There we go. Okay, so $450 billion, and that's the low end, right? And that's an early number, are the annual costs that US companies are spending on disengaged employees. So these are employees this looks like quiet quitting. This looks like doing the minimum, doing exactly what they were hired to do and not going above and beyond. They are disengaged. They are pulling back during meetings. They're not volunteering for projects, initiatives. This is impacting your bottom line. It's stifling your growth. It's putting a cap, a ceiling on your creativity and your innovation within your organization. And this is what it's costing the US companies on an annual basis. Now, if we don't start to shift and understand what the generational dynamics look like in the workplace, you're going to look up in a couple years. And in fact, in 2025, in this year, you're going to see 75% of your workforce are going to be millennials and Gen Z. And here's another figure, about 75% of your leaders, right, at the executive leadership level, they are going to be millennials and Gen Z within about 10 years or so. Okay. So we've got to start to have a strategy today. Now, 74% of employees feel that they're not reaching their full potential due to these poor team dynamics, and they're not getting along. Why are they clashing? They're clashing because they don't understand the context behind understanding their colleagues, behind understanding the people that they work with on a day-to-day basis. Communication is at the crux of all of this. Okay, so in order to understand why they are clashing, you have to understand the context of the generation, right? We all know that we have our stereotypes, our thoughts, right, about each generation. I'll name a few, right? Boomers, they say, shouldn't they be retired, right? Or aren't they? With Gen X, why are they so bossy, right? Zennials, who are they? And millennials, so please stop making everything about an app. Gen Z, I can never find them when I need them, right? These are all stereotypes that we carry around with us. And while I won't say that they're entirely false or incorrect, they don't tell the whole story, right? We know that there's always a bit of truth for each stereotype, if you will, right? But that is always the exception and not the rule, because they just don't encapsulate the full story. So let's dive into understanding each generation better by providing some more context behind them. All right. So first, what I want you to know is around their communication style. And we're going to take this generation by generation. So I'm going to spend just a few moments on this slide, and then we're going to start to dive into really threading the needle here using an analogy that I feel helps to kind of paint the picture a little bit better, right? We're going to be exploring this context behind providing the context behind each generation by diving into and understanding what the technology look like just within the workplace, right? For each of these generations. This will help you to provide the foundational understanding as to why it is does each generation approach work a little differently. What do they value within that space? Okay. There we go. Now let's look at baby boomers. So baby boomers are about 72 million in size. And this is in the US, right? Their communication style is more face to face. It's on the phone, it's formal. Just think about travel. They used to travel to have, big business meetings, right? Think of they value loyalty and hierarchy and the structure. This looks a lot like the corporate environments that you're used to today, and also too what we're starting to outgrow, right, for many reasons. They believe in more formal top down approach. They believe in certain following the hierarchy that has been set, right? You don't jump above your boss to go to their boss or to another level, right? It's all about mining or yeah, mining the hierarchy within that space. There can be misalignment when they view, younger generations as entitled or perhaps maybe impatient to pursuing or climbing the corporate ladder. Now, some of that is rooted in the technology that's available to each of the generations. So boomers were starting to experience the computer, right? Or the evolution of technology in the workplace was moving from an electronic typewriter into more of a PC, right? Now think about the PCs or computers used to fill up an entire room, right? An entire floor, if you will, right? Where I think of those early on IBM computers, they were massive. And when they were able to kind of pare this down to the PC, to every desk, they were essentially were bringing information or the ability to word process, right, on to each desk during the workplace. Now they experienced this change, this shift happened around mid-career, so they were already really settled in how they were working. This was primarily phone. This was handwriting, messages, notes, especially during meetings. This was having dinner and lunch conversations, right? It was about more about relationships and building in that space and how it was documented. I mean, think about early movies, around how newspapers were printed. It was on typewriters, electronic typewriters, right? But you didn't have the word processing that we have today. Okay. So just a bit more context. So you were also too looking at, now this was blinking cursor computer. This is not the full color multiple windows that we have, or even what I'm presenting to you today. This was blinking cursor, DOS prompt, early on computer really focused just on documenting information, right? Think of code. If you understand the back end of code, it looks a little similar to that. Even that has come light years from where it started. So, okay, now let's jump into giving some context more about Gen X. Gen X is about 65 million in size. They also too have the largest debt of all of the generations. Why is this important? This is important because their values are also too rooted in stability and being logical and pragmatic, right? They are adopting some of the influence from boomers where you get a job and you stay in that job for quite some time, right? You may move perhaps between industries or companies, but that wasn't very often. This is why you find that they value very heavily being with a company for 5, 10, 20 years, right? And so when they see they're usually the first ones to call out job hopping with some of the younger generations. So it's the context, right? Because their values in the workplace are all centered around having structure, stability, being able to afford their mortgage, to afford life. All right. Now, their communication is also too very direct. They are efficient. They like email. They like to communicate in that fashion because, in many ways, it serves as a way to memorialize, as well as to set agreements and to put that together in one easy place to track. And email has been a really great way to do that for them. They value independence. So collaboration and teamwork is not necessarily where they lean. They certainly can exist in that space, but it's not where you see them focusing their attention. They're They prefer to do that independent work, and you've probably heard them say, I can do it myself, right? Or I'll do it myself. It's easier to do it myself than to train or teach somebody else. And so, outwardly looking in, we think that what they're doing is actually trying to hoard information, right? That's not what they're doing. Providing a little more context on Gen X, they also too are the forgotten generation where their parents had to be reminded that they existed, right? They would be gone for hours at a time. If you've ever seen Stranger Things, how are these kids literally rolling around town without any parental supervision, right? That is what Gen X is. They are out for 10, 12 hours a day, eating at each other's homes, exploring the various parts of their town and their city, and doing so with very little parental supervision. So and it's kind of a hallmark to the generation. So their independence is a badge of honor. It's not something to be discounted or dismissed. All right. So the introduction of the computer in the workplace, they started to see the computer more around high school time. So moving from the typing class into a word processing class where you're really actually your document still the blinking cursor, right? Because this is the same time around boomers are experiencing it in the workplace. The Gen Z or Gen X is starting to experience this in high school. So they have the opportunity, or they're seeing computer classes in high school. So instead of taking typing, they're taking a word processing class, a computer class in high school. They also, too, you start to see the appearance of computers in the libraries. So this starts to become this starts to become more relevant, right? They start to see it more frequently in their world a bit more. You're also seeing the adoption of some PCs in the home. And then this is also too around the time that color imaging was starting to come on the monitors, and trainings were starting to be held on computers as well. Okay, let's keep going. So let's jump into Zennials. Zennials is the unknown generation. It's what many of us actually don't pay attention to. And actually, they're a really important generation. So they are a spike of about 25 million births that happen in the US between 1977 in 1983. Now, they're this hybrid between Gen X and millennials. So you see them kind of, overlapping between those two generations. But in many ways, this is a hallmark to why it is that they are great connectors. They are the glue. They are the generation that is not well known, but in many ways are helping your teams to kind of stay talking, keeping people engaged. So you'll see, if you notice, Zennials on your teams are actually kind of some of your early leaders, especially within the millennials group, right? Many of us grew up with Gen X, older siblings, perhaps maybe cousins, depending on our family structures. And so we were heavily influenced by Gen X, but also too might have had some of those younger siblings that technically were millennials that were, exposed to computers in a different way. Now, their communication is as really more flexible. So because they can navigate between analog and digital, right? You can send them emails. They know what it's like to have experienced electronic typewriters at some point in their life. They also to know what that blinking cursor looks like on that computer. They started to experience computers, earlier on in their education. So maybe as bringing those computers into the home or experiencing that in college. They also too were part of the wave of now starting to see computer classes earlier on in their education. We see the Mac computers listed here where everything was self-contained. So we were moving from a desktop that had a large monitor with, floppy drives, disk drives, and separate keyboards. Now all of this has been evolving more self-contained, and you're starting to see, you see a PC here on the right side. That tower was enormous, right? And so big you couldn't put it on top of the desk. It had to be under. And so, but this is also too starting to become really normal as part of their lives. So if it wasn't in the home, it was starting to become available in school, and they were certainly starting to see it as they were moving through their university and college experiences. Now, one of the things that Zennials value is adaptability and resourcefulness. So the ability to be able to kind of respond to the changes and the changes in the environments around them, because this is a hallmark to their generation. They are used to things constantly being in flux, right? Things are not staying stable. They're not staying constant. They actually are always changing because they were born in the midst of all of this change. Now, where there can be some misalignment is that they get caught in the middle, right? Because they've experienced both generations, and perhaps the boomers tend to be their parents. And so they were influenced heavily by that generation, to go to college and get a job, and you get a good job and you stay there, you earn a pension, and then you retire. So their values can be a little different, and in fact actually influenced by the older generations as well as some of the younger generations. Now, the other thing you'll notice is that Zennials tend to actually be the parents of the Gen Zers. So I'll get into why that's important here in just a moment. But Zennials, the forgotten or the sometimes overlooked generation. All right, now next let's get into the millennials. The millennials are about 72 million strong, and there seems to be this quote beef, between boomers and millennials. You know, um, that's like this invisible thing that keeps moving, or the exchange of words around stereotypes having to do with each of the generations. But millennials, in fact, actually, their communication is very collaborative and very digital first. So while they're not necessarily exposed so heavily, maybe more mid millennials, they're not so exposed to the analog way of doing things. Certainly the cusp millennials are, but millennials also too are they're very teamwork and very collaborative driven. They like to they value having a purpose, doing meaningful work, right? Collaborating as a team, and also to being readily accessible, or open to receiving feedback. They're not opposed to it. They like actually to help them understand, to guide them along their efforts. They don't like their efforts to be wasted. So provide them feedback. Let them know where they can continue to improve in some areas. Now, where there can be some misalignment is that they feel highly undervalued and overlooked by some of the elder generations, right? So not seen for their true value and efforts in the workplace, being dismissed in many ways. And so that can cause some misalignment here. Now, looking at where they've started to implement the computer, within this generation, is they're starting to experience it sometime around elementary and junior high. So these were part of their early education. They were starting to experience, through computer games and word processing in school. So they were much younger. They've had a longer tail of exposure to technology, right? To computers. So they move into the workforce already having experience for 10 plus years, right, of working directly with a computer. And so to have a workplace where everyone is assigned a desktop, everyone is assigned perhaps maybe even a laptop, right, to doing all of their trainings online, or formally on a computer in a training room. This became really normal for them because this wasn't anything that was out of the usual, right? They were experiencing this already in their daily lives. Okay, now lastly, let's talk about Gen Z, right? Gen Z is about 68 million in size. I mean, good grief, an enormous, right? These are the kids, excuse me, these are the children that are born on the cusp of the Y2K, right? So they were mere babies going through the turn of the century, right? And so they have the lowest debt of all of the generations. And part of that is because the high debt that Gen X and Zennials have are actually because we're funding the college, the education of our children. and even doing so at an earlier age, right? So it's not just college, paying for, earlier education in high school, junior high, elementary, things of that nature. They also too are not necessarily leaning towards owning property, right? Launching into mortgages and, increasing their debt. They're unfortunately they became adults when inflation is, really high in this country. And also to the cost of living and, to purchase property, excuse me, is also really challenging for this generation. So that's contributing to them having the lowest debt. Now, not having all of that debt doesn't apply a lot of the pressures that some of the earlier generations have, right? With being able to, shoulder the debt of their education, shoulder the debt of the responsibility of managing a family. Same thing for, with purchasing a home and all of the, car notes, all of these other life expenses that perhaps maybe are not impacting this generation as much. Now, they prefer communication that is more instant, right? They're growing up with social media at the ready, right? Watching the evolution of Facebook, moving to Instagram. LinkedIn is considered to be a platform that they're not attracted to, right? Because they engage mostly on, other topics, on other platforms that are really focused on the social aspect of it. And they also too rely on many of these platforms for their news and a lot of Google searching that we would normally do. They're doing on TikTok, right? So they prefer it to be visual and in order for them to absorb it, right? It's also too a helpful way for them to absorb much of that information. Now, one thing that's worth noting about Gen Z is that they also too are a generation that has had their entire lives scheduled for them in the majority of cases, right, where we know where our children are at all time. And they, if they're not in school, they're in some type of activity. If they're not in the activity, they are maybe with a friend. And if they're not with a friend, then they're definitely at home. We tend to be able to, or I think we sorry, they are a generation that has always had the exposure of, it always been under the kind of the attention of adults in their lives. So they've not necessarily made a lot of decisions for themselves early on, in contrast to Gen X, where they would spend a good amount of their time out of the home without the parental supervision. That's also true. So they are the opposite. In many ways, we have overscheduled them. We've even selected their friends to a certain extent, right? So we live in a different world than we did when Gen X was growing up. So they value diversity, and that means diversity in many different ways, right? So it's not just the tolerance, it's the acceptance, it's the creating normalcy around not only just the generations, but also to ethnically, culturally, how is it they're experiencing their world, that not everybody is the same. And certainly around having diversity in their approach to the work that they're doing. They value very much flexibility. So give them some reins to be able to execute professionally, flexibility around where and when, right? That they do that work. And so they feel very constrained by the standard corporate life of 9 to 5. It's not appealing to them. So, and to be perfectly honest, the other earlier generations are actually starting to adopt much of this, right? This is why you'll see that why it's so important that when your millennials and Gen Z start to step into your workforce, which they already are, and start to step into those leadership positions, there's got to be an evolution of thought, of strategy as to how it is that you retain them in that space. How do you even attract them? And the standard status quo of this is how we've always done it, from our processes and policies to to how it is that we are supporting our employees, it has to evolve. And Gen Z may have been the most vocal at doing this, but every generation actually benefits from this evolution in the workplace, right? They value very much authenticity. The toxic work environment is completely put off for them. And to be honest, for most of us, right? Although we may feel it is normal and it's what we've grown up with, or what we've dealt with for quite some time, we've seen, and there are studies to show this, that it's not supporting a good mental health status, right? It's not supporting our overall well-being. You've heard the saying that people don't leave jobs, they leave bosses. And part of that is because we're not providing the tools for our leaders to truly be leaders instead of bosses, instead of micromanagers, right? So we've got to start to approach our leadership style by including strategy that considers the generations, right? And how it is that we can collaboratively, collectively work together towards a future of work. Okay. Now, Gen Z also too, they can be, they feel misaligned when they feel misunderstood and dismissed because of maybe their experience, or they're dismissed as inexperienced. Now, they may have a completely different lens and approach to how it is that we do work, but there's a value of being able to bridge the gap between how we've always done it and how we can actually evolve to do it in the future. And Gen Z is willing to lead that charge because they don't care what anyone has to say about their views about the matter, right? And that's fine, but they're a blessing to the workplace. They are a blessing to bring in a voice to many of the thoughts that many of us have in that space. Okay, so this was just a quick talking about how we can understand the generations a little better. And it all starts with understanding the perspectives, understanding the context of which each of these generations come from, right? So what are foundationally, how are they rooted in making some of those decisions? What is driving really some of these false beliefs about the other generations, and how can we use this as a opportunity to not only raise awareness, but build a bridge towards the future of work that we're all looking to thrive in. All right. So that's all for today. I thank you very much for your attention. And once again, I'm Christina Green, and it's been an honor to present to you today. I look forward to connecting with you. If you'd like to connect with me, my information's on the screen, but I'll see you on the next one. Take care.